expansion of the Gulf War is drawing mixed reaction from around the world. The Soviet Union, Iran, and China are expressing regret. But France's ruling Socialist Party calls the land offensive unavoidable and blames what it calls the suicidal obstinacy of Saddam Hussein. CNN's Gary Daughters has more reaction.
The people of Iraq did not have to wait very long for their leader Saddam Hussein to confirm the ground campaign had begun. Saddam's response, defiance.
Fight them, brave Iraqis. The men of the Mother of Battles and the Qadisiyah battle. Fight them of your faith in God. Fight them.
From the Kuwaitis, invaded by Iraq on August 2nd, a sense of relief. A spokesman for Kuwait's exiled government said, quote, "We are very glad the liberation of our government has begun." Citing thousands of Iraqi troop surrenders, Kuwaiti radio optimistically said the offensive could be over within days. The European community threw its weight behind the ground attack, and coalition member Britain expressed typical optimism.
It will not, I believe, be a long conflict, but it may be a fierce one. There is no doubt in my mind that it is an absolutely justifiable conflict and that we will win it.
From the Israelis, praise for President Bush.
That there's a great deal of admiration in Israel for President Bush's leadership and total support for the policy that's been adopted to finish this thing off, and I think we're seeing the beginning of the end.
Are you very pleased then that the U.S. troops have gone in, obviously?
Our feeling is there was no choice. We support the president.
In parts of the Arab world, the Allied offensive provoked a sense of bitterness and anger. The Jordanian government said the offensive goes beyond the framework of international legality and expressed the hope the Iraqis will, quote, repel this aggression because they are fighting to defend their rights and the future of their nation. Libya's Muammar Gaddafi said the offensive is not aimed at liberating Kuwait, but offending the Arab nation in front of the entire world. Egypt, taking part in the ground push on the Allied side, said its forces have a mission to liberate Kuwait and will not cross into Iraq. In Moscow, many demonstrators at a pro-democracy rally said they support the Allied offensive, but the spokesman at the Soviet Foreign Ministry expressed disappointment and said the differences between the Soviet peace plan accepted by Iraq and the Allied conditions in the recent ultimatum were not worth fighting over.
They could be agreed within the Security Council of the United Nations within 24 to 48 hours. It is still not too late to do so.
Finally, from the battlefront, there was this reaction from a soldier in a Saudi ground unit that crossed into Kuwait, took Iraqi prisoners, and apparently is looking for more.
We would like to liberate Kuwait from Saddam Hussein, and we will try to follow him until we kill Saddam Hussein.
Gary Daughters, CNN reporting.
Our coverage in the war in the Gulf will continue. I'm Dave Michaels.
And still to come, we'll go live to the Pentagon for an update from correspondent Wolf Blitzer. I'm Molly McCoy. Stay with CNN.
This is CNN.
The big guns boom, part of what U.S. President George Bush calls the final phase of the effort to oust Iraq from Kuwait.
Allied field commanders report Saddam Hussein's troops are surrendering by the thousands, but the commander of Operation Desert Storm warns the war is not over yet. CNN's coverage of the war in the Gulf continues. I'm Dave Michaels.
I'm Molly McCoy. And as the ground war goes on and indeed intensifies, we take you live to the Pentagon. CNN's Wolf Blitzer is standing by live. Wolf?
Molly, CNN has learned that as of Sunday morning, earlier today, Washington time, there were 11 U.S. killed in action during the first stage of this ground war. Now, sources here at the Pentagon caution that there is a lag in the intelligence information reaching Washington from CENTCOM, from the U.S. military headquarters in Riyadh. But as of this morning, there were 11 U.S. killed in action. We do not know how many were wounded. Initial reports, these are all initial reports, reaching the Pentagon are extremely upbeat. But sources again caution that there has been some serious fighting and more is still expected. British Desert Rats and French troops are to the west of the huge U.S. Army 7th Corps moving into Iraq, and all of them are to the west of the elite Republican Guard, Iraq's best soldiers. So far, there has only been a few initial encounters with the Republican Guard. In the words of some sources here, nothing too major yet, but officials, of course, are bracing for some more serious action with the Republican Guard. U.S. Marines are moving right behind Saudi and Kuwaiti troops south and west of Kuwait City. But as of right now, we are told here at the Pentagon by sources, the capital of Kuwait has not yet been taken. Still, sources claim that that objective is within sight and could be only hours away. These are, again, let me repeat, these are claims coming from sources who have good information here at the Pentagon. This is also, by the way, reportedly the case involving two other important towns in Kuwait nearby, near to the Kuwaiti capital of Kuwait City. Sources here also say that the U.S. and other allied forces have spotted large fires in Kuwait City. Buildings have reportedly been set on fire by Iraqi troops. We don't know exactly what buildings, but this is not part of the fires that were set in the days leading up to this U.S. and allied ground offensive involving oil wells. These are buildings that have reportedly been set on fire in Kuwait City. Now, how long will this ground offensive last? How long will the war last? Informed Pentagon sources insist that based on these initial exchanges with the Iraqi military, it should not take, in their words, more than a few more days of combat to remove Iraqi forces from Kuwait. Again, these are initial reports, very upbeat, certainly the basis for some of the very, very confident statements made earlier today by General Norman Schwarzkopf, the commander of Operation Desert Storm. The sources here also tell CNN that the Iraqis appear to have been, quote, totally surprised by the speed and power of the ground offensive. One informed source said, quote, they had no idea how fast we would be moving, end quote. The sources also say many Iraqi soldiers in Kuwait and in southern Iraq itself are described as, quote, searching for anything white in order to surrender. But some Iraqi military, what they call political officers, assigned to specific Iraqi military units, are still reportedly executing soldiers planning on giving up. Now, joining us now in our Washington bureau is Jim Blackell, our CNN military analyst. Jim, maybe we can discuss some of these initial, very, very upbeat reports coming from the ground offensive. As I said, certainly the basis for General Schwarzkopf's optimism. What is your initial sense of these initial reports?
Well, Wolf, as you said, they appear to be very upbeat and optimistic, and I would urge us to be a little bit circumspect and wait to see the later returns. And in fact, in December, the House Armed Services Committee asked me and some of my colleagues at the Center for Strategic and International Studies to take a look at some scenarios that we could discuss. And we looked at this one, which would involve an attack up the coast by basically infantry forces accompanied by armored and mech, with a large armored thrust around the flank, which, if your reports, the reports coming to you are correct, seems to be the way, at least initially, this conflict is unfolding. In that scenario, we estimated that the 7th Corps would take about 8.5 days to get through the lines, around the Iraqi fortifications, up to fix and engage, ultimately to destroy the Republican Guards. And if we can look at the map, we'll see what that might look like. We suggested that the infantry thrust would come along the coast, and the 7th Corps would go around this way, finding and fixing the Republican Guards, ultimately liberating Kuwait City. Now, there's a couple of assumptions we had to make back in December, of course. We didn't know exactly what the situation was. The critical one, of course, is the strength of the Republican Guards. We assumed then that they had the 700 to 800 T-72 tanks that we all believed that they had. And apparently, they are not quite as strong now as they were then, given the pounding that they received from Allied air campaigns. That might explain some of the speed with which the Allies have been able to proceed to that location. The second thing we weren't able to anticipate was the size of the 7th Corps. If these reports are correct, that 7th Corps has not only the divisions, the armored divisions it brought with it from Germany, but also the British and the French armored forces, it's a very, very large armored corps indeed, somewhere around 1,300 to 1,400 tanks, making it one of the largest armored corps in the history of mechanized warfare, giving it much more combat power than most analysts, including myself, anticipated it would have. This would go a long way to explaining the initial success, but I must urge caution that there's a lot to happen before we have the decisive defeat of the Republican Guards. There are a total of 14 armored divisions in Kuwait, in the Kuwaiti theater, and it may well be that there are several of those divisions that are coherent and cohesive enough that they could mount a credible defense against this thrust that could perhaps even mount a counteroffensive, even if the 7th Corps achieves its objective much faster than we anticipated. We'll just have to wait and see, Wolf.
Jim, this U.S. Army 7th Corps, this is the corps that is based in Germany that came over after the November 8th doubling of the U.S. deployment. These are really the best U.S. Army mechanized divisions around. These were the troops that would have fought the Soviet Union at the Fulda Pass. Isn't that correct?
They are part of the very large U.S. Army armored force stationed in Germany. There actually are 2 corps of this size. And there's probably some competition between the two for bragging rights as to which one is the best. But when they make a deployment of this nature, generally what they do, and is what I'm sure they did in this deployment, is they take the best out of the other units to help out the 7th Corps that's deploying. So no doubt this is the best that the Army could assemble on short notice and transport in such short time. And you are absolutely correct in that they represent the U.S. Army's finest when they're put together with the other forces that came in from the United States as well.
Thank you very much, Jim Blackwell, CNN's military analyst in Washington. Let me just briefly recap initial reports, and I stress the word initial reports reaching the Pentagon, extremely upbeat. The ground offensive appears to be moving ahead much better than some U.S. military planners had thought, but they quickly caution that this war is by no means over. The fighting, there has been some fierce fighting, and a lot more is expected, but there is a sense, based on these initial reports, based on the initial casualty reports of 11 U.S. killed as of earlier this morning, that Kuwait City, according to some of these sources, could be liberated within a matter of hours. But it hasn't been liberated yet. Wolf Blitzer, CNN, reporting live from the Pentagon.
Thanks, Wolf. Updating again, the Allied ground offensive against Iraq forces is now roughly 17 hours old. General Norman Schwarzkopf says his troops are doing a great job. Desert Storm's commander says Allied forces are moving north with great speed. He says they have met light resistance, sustained remarkably light casualties, and achieved all of their first-day objectives. A senior U.S. military official says coalition troops have reached the edges of Kuwait City, and Kuwait's government in exile says the Allies have recaptured the strategic island of Filaka. There's no official confirmation of either report. George Bush today offered prayers for the coalition forces and the Iraqi people. Advisors describe him as being pleased with the way the ground war has gone so far. Baghdad is broadcasting a very different version of the Gulf War story. Iraq radio reports the Allied offensive has failed utterly. In a radio address shortly after the start of the ground fight, Saddam Hussein urged his troops to show no mercy.
The Israeli government is expressing hopes for total and rapid success to the Allies in the ground offensive against Iraq. Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Aarons says Iraq's war machine must be destroyed to ensure peace in the Middle East and relative safety for Israel. Aarons says his country has faced repeated incursions by Arabs since the Gulf War began.
We had an infiltrator come through last night from Jordan. He managed to kill an Israeli soldier, a Bedouin Arab. He was killed himself in the process. We've had repeated incidents of this sort these past few weeks. I don't know that the Jordanian military are being as successful as they should be, or maybe are trying as hard as they should to prevent this kind of infiltration, and it's a cause of concern for us, of course.
A full curfew has been reimposed in the occupied territories by the Israeli military. The move has been made to prevent pro-Iraqi unrest.
CNN's Rick Salinger joins us now live from Saudi Arabia with an update from there. Rick?
The feeling here is that it is going well, very, very well. I talked to a number of the troops out in the field today, and the feeling among them is almost euphoric. It's quite reminiscent of the first day of this war when the air campaign began. The ground phase started at 4 o'clock in the morning, local time here, when the troops crossed the border with Kuwait, what they call the Saddam line. The ground campaign was moving fast. So fast, the entire first day objectives were accomplished in just 12 hours. 5,500 enemy prisoners of war were taken. Some waved white flags of surrender. Others held pamphlets dropped by Allied planes telling them how to give up. Many were wounded, but friendly casualties were reported as light. The commander-in-chief of Operation Desert Storm, General Norman Schwarzkopf, appeared confident as he left his war room to meet reporters. He said Iraqi resistance was weak, with one exception.
One of the Marine task forces was counterattacked with enemy armor. The Marines immediately brought their own artillery to bear. They also brought their anti-tank weapons to bear. We also brought our air forces to bear, and the counterattack was very quickly repulsed, and they retreated. I can't tell you the exact number of loss of tanks, but there were several tanks that were lost in that particular battle.
The thrust on the ground was supported by air, naval, and amphibious assault units from a dozen countries. The Kuwaiti news agency quickly reported that Failaka Island, 15 miles off Kuwait City, was taken from the Iraqis.
They detained so many, about from 500 to 1,000 Iraqi soldiers, and the island was purely occupied by the Allied forces.
As the coalition moved forward, initial reports of the Iraqis using chemical weapons proved false. There was little doubt among the troops that the decision to mount a ground war was a good one.
We're glad that the president, made the decision to go ahead and go in because we gave him too much time already.
If we don't drive him out now, eventually, on down the line, he's just going to get stronger and stronger.
Their commander-in-chief said the Allies were moving forward with great speed.
Are you going around or over, and is that why there's little opposition?
We're going to go around, over, through, on top, underneath, and any other way.
Have you gone?
He said the troops are doing a great job. Some of the initial poor reports from reporters traveling with the troops are now coming in, and they indicate the Marines and some of the other soldiers ran into resistance going into Kuwait, not so much from the soldiers of the Kuwaiti, or make it the Iraqi army, but rather the minefields, and they say the ground was rather soft from the rain. They became bogged down in some places, but quickly picked up and moved on. As for General Schwarzkopf, he says it's a dramatic success so far, but he cautions this war is not over yet. Live in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, Rick Salinger, CNN.
Thanks, Rick. Our coverage of the ground war continues. Stay with CNN. Iraq is telling a totally different version of the stories from that of the Allies. A military communique broadcast on Iraqi radio says the Allied ground assault has failed utterly. The statement says, quote, the scoundrels of aggressors are crying for help and swimming in their blood. And Saddam Hussein is urging his troops to show no mercy. But despite the fierce fighting in southern Iraq and Kuwait, life appears to be near normal today in wartime Baghdad. CNN's Peter Arnett filed this report, which has been cleared by Iraqi censors.
At some times, the war seemed near Baghdad. Air raid alerts signaled the appearance in the distant skies of multinational aircraft that have bombed the capital every day for nearly 5 weeks. But in fact, there has been little bombing in Baghdad today. The action is much further away, in southern Iraq and in Kuwait. Baghdad was actually at its busiest since the war began January 17th. People lined up for essentials such as kerosene for lanterns and cookers, a product still reasonably priced at around $1 a gallon. Kerosene lines straggle all over the city. The Baghdad bus terminal was thriving, with travelers coming to and from the capital. And shoeshine boys were doing a brisk business. An air of normalcy that seemed bizarre under the circumstances, a major land war in progress just over 400 miles away. The calmness of Baghdad is deceptive. Part of it is a resignation to war and its calamities. Many veterans had gathered at a downtown coffee shop, passing the time by playing dominoes as they discussed the ground war. All said they had tuned to early morning broadcasts of the Voice of America, the BBC, and other broadcasts from neighboring countries, and were aware of developments. Few seemed to doubt that the odds against the Iraqi forces were almost insurmountable, but that this battle wouldn't be the end of Iraqi power.
We will try again. If we are defeated now, we will try again and again and again.
Even though President Saddam Hussein had made a radio broadcast late morning, few in the city had heard about it. Saddam Hussein's short, emotional speech was a rallying call to his people and military to resist by any means. He called the ground war a betrayal.
They betrayed everybody. But God Almighty, Allah, is stronger than everyone. And he is the only one who is always watching, capable of everything, the Almighty. And he will put an end to their invasion.
It was the second appeal by Saddam Hussein to his people in 2 days. Iraqis we talked to felt that the ground war was inevitable, and some felt defeat was just as inevitable.
It's a war, and I'm with you. We cannot to fight 29 government, and with this force, with this technology, with this very arms, and about 730,000 army in the Arab island. But everything we can only to hurt you some.
Baghdad functioned normally as a capital throughout the long Iran-Iraq war, even when hundreds of thousands were engaged in major battles just a few hundred miles away. But all we have met agree that this much more destructive war will have far greater short and long impacts on society. Peter Arnett, CNN, Baghdad.
And again, we remind you that all reports from Iraq are approved by government officials.
Let's go to CNN in Washington now, and to Mary Tillotson, who has a guest to discuss the operations taking place this morning. Mary.
Our guest is Iraq's ambassador to the United States. I beg your pardon. I beg your pardon. We've all been up a long while. You probably longer than I. Kuwait's ambassador to the United States, Sheikh Saud Nasir Al-Sabah. Have you had any reports as yet, Mr. Ambassador, to indicate that there has been any use as yet of either chemical or biological weapons by Saddam Hussein, the thing that I think most Americans have most feared in his arsenal?
Mary, let me first of all express our deep sense of gratitude and thanks to that man in the White House, the President of the United States, and to all our friends in the United States of America, and to King Fahd of Saudi Arabia, and all our allies who have been involved in Operation Desert Storm. We are deeply indebted for their support and their assistance in liberating my country. Secondly, the reports you've been receiving, I'm cautiously optimistic that everything is going well, even better than many analysts have given this operation. Hopefully we have not yet seen any chemical warfare taking place, and we are also praying and hoping that it will not take place during this operation. The reports are still sketchy coming out from this whole operation, but from the people inside Kuwait, we've had some reports coming in a couple of days ago that there has been a lot of mass executions of Kuwaiti citizens, rounding up of young people, the burning of many buildings, government departments. I think it's an act of revenge on the part of the Iraqis once they sense that the operation, the invasion, is in the process of taking place.
We've had a report from Wolf Blitzer at the Pentagon that preliminary indications are that at least among U.S. forces fighting on the ground, there have been no more than 11 casualties. One is more than any American would wish, but at least better than it might have been. Do you have any numbers as yet on the overall Allied situation? How many Kuwaitis, Saudis, Senegalese may have been lost?
Mary, one casualty is one more than we hope to have here. And I would refer to what General Perry Smith has been saying all along. This is going to be hopefully a mopping up operation, and that we should be ready to be impressed by this operation as a whole. And having said that, the rate of casualties we hope will be minimal. I think every human life involved in this operation is so valuable to us all, whether they are U.S. or other nationalities. We feel and we pray with all the families of those soldiers, those brave young men and women who are in the operation.
But no hard numbers as yet that you would care to share with us?
I think no one could give you a very honest number with regard to the casualties we have now. I think the Central Command and General Schwarzkopf has a very faint idea exactly what is going on inside, and the reports are coming out from the commanders in the field to the Central Command with regard to the casualties. The number of 11, I think, is optimistic, but again, I believe that, and I hope it will not be higher than this in the near future.
The Soviets offered a chance to get a withdrawal from your country by Iraq in 3 weeks. Why was it important to members of the coalition to, in effect, humiliate Saddam Hussein and say, no, you don't leave on your time schedule, you leave on ours?
We have given Saddam Hussein 7 months to leave Kuwait. Every diplomatic path has been explored in every way. We reached a stage where the president and all our allied coalition forces were aware of what's going on inside Kuwait with regard to the brutality against the civilians inside, with the massive destruction of the country taking place. So the fact of giving Saddam Hussein more than what he actually needs getting out of Kuwait is, I think, not doing justice to the people inside the country, to the civilians, and to even the forces who are allied against Saddam Hussein on the border there, because everyone was ready to go in, and Saddam Hussein does not need 3 weeks to get out of Kuwait. It took him 5 hours to get in. It should take him the same time to get out of Kuwait. We're not concerned with whether Saddam Hussein gets out with his forces intact. It's not our desire.
Well, you want the contrary, don't you?
We want the country back. Saddam Hussein had the chance to get out. He was given the 15th of January as a deadline to get out. He did not. He was given 12 hours to get out. He did not get out. He asked for it, and he got it.
We have our State Department correspondent, Ralph Begleiter, joining us. I know he has a question about the political ramifications of the situation now, too. Ralph?
Ambassador Al-Sabah, you've waited a long time for this moment for the U.S. to declare the beginning of the ground war and for the move to actually expel Iraqi forces. When you move back into Kuwait, can you live with Saddam Hussein still in power as your neighbor?
Ralph, I cannot give you any speculations with regard whether we would be able to live with Saddam Hussein, but quite evidently will not, if Saddam Hussein survives this war now, I don't believe that Saddam Hussein will be in a position to inflict any damage or any threat to neighboring countries. But having said that, I hope that the Iraqi people will realize the misery and destruction and suffering that their leader has put his country and all countries in the region through. And I hope that they will realize the importance of getting rid of Saddam Hussein and his collaborators and his regime.
Does the humiliation of a ground war, forcing him to leave, make it more likely he will not survive politically, even if he lives through the war?
Well, I hope he will not survive it. I mean, we heard about this.
In any sense?
We've been hearing about this, the mother of battles and etc., all this rhetoric we've been hearing for the last 7 months. Now, evidently, it's going to be the mother of defeat and the mother of humiliation for Saddam Hussein and his regime and his army.
Mr. Ambassador, Kuwait has taken an interesting position in the past, not allying itself with the United States, not allying itself with the Soviet Union or other nations in the Gulf. In the future, having gone through this trial by fire, so to speak, with the coalition aligned with the United States, will Kuwait be able to, would Kuwait invite American forces to remain in the region, perhaps even ground forces to remain to prevent a recurrence of this invasion?
Ralph, I think you're well aware of Kuwait's foreign policy in the past with regard to keeping the whole Gulf area and the Indian Ocean and the Arab seas free from any foreign presence, because we did not believe, emanating from the policy of non-alignment, we did not believe that the whole area should be a center for escalation of foreign presence of foreign forces, and for that purpose we were following that policy. But evidently the person who has encouraged the presence of foreign forces in the region is Saddam Hussein. Now, how we going to look at this in the future for the sake of peace, security and stability of the region, we have to certainly, undoubtedly, look into it in a different context and in consultation with our allies in the region, in the Gulf Cooperation Council, with our allies in the Arab world, including our allies in the United States and others, in finding a kind of a security arrangement for the region, and also to restore peace and security, and to look at it in a new different perspective, and which has been referred to many times by the President and by Secretary Baker, for a new world order. And we would like to emphasize here for a new regional order. And I hope our people and the people in the region realize the importance of creating a new regional order whereby our people will feel safe as well as people in the region altogether.
Sheikh Saud Nasir Al-Sabah, Kuwait ambassador to the United States, thank you for having joined us. Let's go back to Atlanta now.
Thanks very much for that, Mary. Stay with us. Our coverage will continue.
CNN has learned that as of this morning, 11 U.S. military personnel have been killed in action in the ground war. But Pentagon sources say casualties are generally light, and they say it should not take more than a few days to remove Iraqi troops from Kuwait. A multinational wave sweeping into Kuwait and Iraq is reporting light resistance and the completion of first-day objectives less than a full day into the ground war. Kuwaiti officials report the Allies have retaken the strategic island of Failaka off the Kuwaiti coast, but that has not been confirmed by Allied commanders. The operations commander said earlier today that so far the ground offensive has been very successful.
10 hours into this ground offensive, more than 5,500 prisoners have been captured. And we received reports of many hundreds more north of our positions with white surrender flags. Friendly casualties have been extremely light. As a matter of fact, remarkably light. So far, the offensive is progressing with dramatic success. The troops are doing a great job, but I would not be honest with you if I didn't remind you that this is the very early stages. We are a little more than 12 hours into this offensive, and the war is not over yet.
The Allies are taking prisoners of war in their speedy push into Kuwait, and Pentagon sources tell CNN some Iraqi units are looking for anything white so they can surrender. President Bush attended church today to pray for the Allied forces and the Iraqi people. He is said to be pleased with the first stage of the ground war. However, Baghdad radio denies the Allies have achieved any of their goals. Baghdad says the Allies have suffered heavy losses. Iraqi radio also told its troops today that death with dignity was more honorable than a life with humiliation.
British Prime Minister John Major has just spoken to reporters in London about the ground war. We go live now to London and CNN's Mitch Leopard. Mitch?
Well, it's been 17 to 18 hours now since the Allied land offensive against Iraqi forces in Kuwait has begun. There has been a news blackout in London on the strategic activities in the Gulf, and the Prime Minister has been at his weekend home Chequers throughout the morning, but he's just arrived back in London at number 10 Downing Street and made this statement.
Thus far, things seem to be going very well indeed. We are pleased with what has happened so far. The plans do seem to be ahead of schedule, and as you will have heard earlier, there are a very substantial number of Iraqi prisoners that have been taken. I must say at this stage, though, that this is a very early stage of the campaign. It may well be tougher in days to come, though the beginning has been as satisfactory as we could have hoped. We are still getting continuing reports of atrocities in Kuwait City, the damage to buildings, blowing up the parliamentary building, and the other atrocities that I mentioned earlier today, they are continuing. And I think that does illustrate very clearly that we were right to take this action now and not to delay any longer. I'm afraid there's no further information that I can give you at the moment, but I'm happy to take one or two questions on non-operational matters if that would be helpful.
Prime Minister, do you feel that the accounts coming out from some Allied centres are in danger of being euphoric, or are you yourself just being cautious?
No, I think it is right to be cautious. This is a very early stage of the campaign. We must wait and see what happens over a longer period. There may be more difficult days ahead than those we have had yet thus far.
While the Europeans and Britons are overwhelmingly behind Allied governments in this military action, there are those that do not support it. Those opposed to the coalition's military action marched from London's Central Mosque. The protesters marched past the American embassy shouting shame, and then marched on to both the Saudi and Kuwaiti embassies as well. About an hour ago, I talked to the British Defense Secretary Tom King, who had praise for both the cohesiveness of the alliance and today's statement by General Schwarzkopf concerning the correct assessment of just where the war is right now.
We knew that the first forces that we would encounter would be the perhaps the less capable and the ones with perhaps the most dubious morale of the Iraqi forces. He very wisely said these are very early hours of this campaign, there's a long way to go yet. And I think that we all understand exactly why he said that.
Could it possibly be preparing us for the worst?
No, I think it's a right balance. We've had this problem, if you think back in this extraordinary whole campaign. We had an air campaign first, and getting that balance right at the start, when I think it was relief in that very first day that it had gone without great setbacks, that there might have been disappointments, but not a major setback for the whole campaign, and people then very impressed with those pictures of high precision bombing, and there was almost a feeling of euphoria around. And then when some of us tried to say, just steady on, there's a long way to go yet, people were then around the opposite story, saying people losing confidence in the air campaign. And what I think is very important, and what I saw General Schwarzkopf very clearly doing, is trying to get the right balance here. People not to get overexcited. There's a start. It's got underway. He made clear that he felt how it had gone initially, but the very wise warning, there's a long way still to go. Not to say it's all going to go against us afterwards. We hope to see this carried through successfully, reasonably quickly, and with the minimum casualties. Those are the objectives to which we're working, but it is very early to see how well those objectives will be achieved.
Britain's Defense Secretary Tom King, and I'm Mitch Leopard, CNN Live in London.
Thank you for that, Mitch. We go now to Saudi Arabia. CNN's Rick Salinger joins us on the line from Saudi Arabia. What do you have for us, Rick?
Well, for the second time today, the air raid sirens are sounding in central Saudi Arabia, and for the second time it appears that there has been an incoming Scud missile intercepted by Patriot missiles. Just a few moments ago, we saw 2 Patriots being launched from nearby where we are into the sky, and there appeared to be a large explosion in the air. It looked very much like the 4th of July fireworks that we are so used to. But indeed, it is believed that this was an Iraqi Scud missile coming into central Saudi Arabia, intercepted in the air. Now, the big question that always follows this is what happens to the debris. Earlier today, the debris landed at a school on the outskirts of Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, causing considerable damage, but no injuries. The school was vacant at the time. We don't know about the debris in this case, where it might have come down. As of right now, no official confirmation about the Scud or an intercept, or if there are any injuries. Back to you.
Rick Salinger reporting from central Saudi Arabia. Thanks, Rick.
We go back now to another location in Saudi Arabia and to CNN's Charles Jacob. Charles, what can you tell us?
Well, here in eastern Saudi Arabia, the air raid sirens have gone off, but as Rick Salinger just reported, it appears that the incoming Scud was aimed at central Saudi Arabia, not this part of the country. The question being asked here by a lot of military people is where those Scuds were launched from. We've received indications in the past few days that a lot of these Scuds had been launched from Baghdad itself. Indeed, that some of the Scud launchers may be in civilian areas that would be extremely hard for the Allied air forces to target, creating yet another problem here. That is, do they go into a civilian area to try to hunt for a mobile Scud launcher with a chance of taking out some civilian homes? That's something they're still going to have to take a look at. The big news, besides the alarms going off here, is that the ground war seems to be moving along fairly successfully. A lot of media people who've been up north today indicated that the resistance, at least in extreme southern Kuwait along the border with Saudi Arabia, by the resistance by Iraqi troops had essentially collapsed, that there was none there. Now, military people who keep telling us, as the Pentagon keeps telling people, that no one should be overly optimistic about any of this news, that could be a lot of fight left in the Iraqi army, and that the Republican Guards, those tough elite troops that everybody has spoken about so much, have really not been encountered yet. But the bottom line here is there doesn't seem to be any incoming Scuds or outgoing Patriot missiles, and the news, at least for the Allies from the war front in Kuwait, seems to be good. But again, the war is not very old. It's not even 24 hours old. We'll have to wait and see what develops in the coming hours and days. One moment, we're getting a siren now. That's one single long tone, and that's the all clear, meaning that the all clear, once again, has sounded here in eastern Saudi Arabia. Charles Jaco, CNN, reporting live from Saudi Arabia.
All right, thank you, Charles. Good to hear that all clear. We will continue with our Gulf coverage war right after this.
In a remote region of Turkey, we have one of our correspondents, Stefan Katsonis. He's live on the phone from Turkey now. Stefan, what can you tell us from there?
Well, the first thing that must be said about Turkish reaction to this war is that they're grateful not to be directly involved in it. I'm speaking to you from a town that lies where Turkey, Iraq, and Syria meet. The streets here were virtually empty a few weeks ago because everyone who could afford to had fled north. At that time, they couldn't be sure that Iraq would not lob chemical warheads in this direction, and as Turkish tanks and infantry poured into the region, they feared their government might decide to launch an attack from the north. Now, however, the Turkish army is dug in and quiet. There's been no discernible movement of troops here since the ground war began, so people are quite relaxed. You would almost forget there's a war being fought across the border if it weren't for the fact that some 100 Iraqi refugees show up in villages around here every day. And at night you can sometimes see anti-aircraft fire and hear the faint rumble of bombings from deep inside northern Iraq. If you dig deeper, however, into public opinion here, there are a lot of contradictory feelings about the war. There are Muslims who believe this is a holy war, and there are Kurdish nationalists who believe Saddam has helped their cause, but they are a minority, it seems. Most people here are not happy living next to a man like Saddam Hussein. They have watched him get stronger over the years. They've heard him threaten to go to war with Turkey in the past, and they heard the stories of gas attacks on Kurdish villages 2.5 years ago. But there is a lot of sympathy for the Iraqi people, both because they are neighbors and because they are fellow Muslims. Most people point out that the Soviet Union and the West made this man strong, and now the Allies are pummeling Iraqi towns to correct their mistakes. In the end, nobody is happy with this war, but few are the Turks who want Saddam as a neighbor when it's over. Stefan Katsonis reporting live for CNN from Jizre, near the Iraqi border.
We thank you for that report, Dave.
Saudi forces were among the first Allied ground troops to push into occupied Kuwait. ITN correspondent Sandy Gall was with the Saudis as they broke through.
At dawn this morning, Saudi troops swept across Saddam Hussein's much-vaunted berm, the defensive barrier of sand ridges and ditches to halt an invasion, and entered Kuwait. Heavy artillery hammered the Iraqi defenses just before the attack went in. But there was no flaming oil, as threatened by Saddam, no Iraqi resistance. Hundreds of Saudi tanks and armored personnel carriers poured nose to tail through breaches in the berm and fanned out across the desert.
We are entering now to Kuwait. We would like to liberate Kuwait from Saddam Hussein, and we will try to follow him until we kill Saddam Hussein.
The operation went like clockwork, columns of tanks and armored personnel carriers moving to a prearranged plan, advancing on a broad front past empty Iraqi foxholes and one shattered heavy gun. An empty Iraqi position and Saudi armor in the Kuwaiti desert. Now they're moving forward in the direction of Kuwait City. 10 or 15 miles inside Kuwait, the lead Saudi column took their first Iraqi prisoners. Sandy Gall, IGN, with Saudi troops inside Kuwait.
U.S. jet fighter pilots were over Kuwait when the Allied ground offensive began. CNN's Greg Lamont reports one pilot described the action below as a look at hell.
Allied fighter jets returning safely after another apparent successful mission over Kuwait. What made these pilots special, however, is that they were over Kuwait when the order was given to begin the Allied ground offensive.
We went in about the center of the border between Iraq between Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, and we could tell that there was some kind of ground fire or something going on both the west and the east side of us.
Throughout the border?
Throughout the border.
What about Kuwait City?
All you could tell from Kuwait City was that its lights were still on. There was quite a glow from that area.
A glow so bright, this pilot saw hell.
It looks like what I envisioned hell would look like. I hope I never have the opportunity to see firsthand, but the country of Kuwait is burning.
The massive ground war begins after more than a month of punishing aerial attacks on Iraq and Kuwait. And even though these pilots have done their part, they say they can't do it all.
It could be the total solution, but if the end result of the effort here is to retake territory, the Air Force clearly is beyond its scope. We hope that we would provide an umbrella over the Army and soften up targets so the Army would have an easier time of it. But the mission of the Army is to take terrain and territory, and that's why it'd be beyond the scope of the air mission.
It's believed part of the war campaign will entail the doubling of air missions over Iraq and Kuwait, while ground forces inch their way into mine-laden lands. But in just the first 10 hours of the ground offensive, more than 5,500 Iraqi POWs were either captured or surrendered as Allied troops faced very little opposition. General Norman Schwarzkopf, head of the Allied forces, says he is very delighted, but cautions, in war, the situation can change dramatically at any moment. Greg Lamont, CNN, Saudi Arabia.